You are awake.
The light is wrong. Not wrong in any alarming sense. Wrong in the way that Mediterranean light is always slightly wrong to people who have grown up further from the equator. More intense, more present, already at this early hour, carrying a warmth that northern light doesn't have until midday. The shadows it casts are sharp. The white stone of the building across the lane is almost painful to look at directly.
You are in Athens.
The year is approximately 430 BC, and Athens is at the absolute peak of what later centuries will call its golden age. The Parthenon, the great temple to Athena on the Acropolis, the building that will be more imitated, more studied, more argued over than any other structure in Western architectural history, was completed 2 years ago, in 432 BC. Its paint is still bright. The Greeks painted their marble in vivid colors, red and blue and gold, a fact that later centuries, encountering only the pale weathered stone, will find difficult to accept. The building you see today is not the building that Athens built. The building Athens built was louder than that.
Pericles is the dominant political figure of the city. His name will become synonymous with this period, with the democratic experiment and the architectural ambitions, and the confident assertion that Athens is the school of all Greece, the model that every other civilization ought to aspire to. He is wrong about this in ways that will become clear within a few years, but in 430 BC, he still believes it, and more importantly, Athens still believes it. You are in the Kerameikos district, the Potter's Quarter, outside the city walls to the northwest, where the workshops of the ceramic industry cluster alongside the road that leads into the city through the Depilon Gate. Athens does not smell like the clean marble classicism of the history books. Athens smells like a working city, kiln smoke and animal dung and olive oil, and the particular dusty warmth of packed earth streets in summer.
The Kerameikos is also, paradoxically, where Athens' most important cemetery is located. The road to the city passes through it. Visitors to Athens have always entered past the graves of the Athenian dead, past the funerary monuments that line the sacred way, past the memorials to the soldiers who died in the wars that made Athens what it is. The cemetery and the city are not separated. The dead are part of the approach.
Your language problem here is, for the first time in your travels, somewhat manageable.
Ancient Greek, specifically Attic Greek, the dialect of Athens, is the ancestor of a significant portion of your vocabulary. If you speak English, roughly 60% of your medical and scientific vocabulary comes from Greek, along with enormous amounts of philosophical, political, and literary vocabulary. Democracy, philosophy, history, tragedy, comedy, economy, politics, theater, academy, athletics, chaos, cosmos, crisis, rhetoric, logic, ethics. The words themselves came from here, from this city, from this decade.
This does not mean you can speak Attic Greek. It means that when you encounter Greek words, you will sometimes recognize their descendants. You will hear the roots of words you know. A man in the Agora will say something with the word demokratia in it, and you will hear almost what he means. A philosopher on a street corner will use the word logos, and you will catch the ghost of logic, of word, of reason.
But you will not be able to respond. Not in any way that makes sense. The gap between recognizing roots and speaking a language is enormous, and Attic Greek grammar, its cases, its dual number, its extensive verbal system, is not bridged by vocabulary recognition alone.
The city through the Dipilon Gate opens onto the Agora.
The Agora is the center of Athenian civic life. Not primarily a market, though buying and selling happen here constantly, but the public space where the city thinks and argues and decides. The law courts are here. The administrative offices, the bouleuterion where the city council meets, the tholos where the executive committee lives and sleeps to be available at all hours, are here. The stoas, the long colonnaded walkways, provide shade for the conversations that are, in Athens, as much a civic institution as any formal structure.
And the people in the Agora in 430 BC. On a morning in summer, you will encounter a cross-section of Athenian society that immediately and emphatically contradicts the simplified version of Athens that later centuries will construct. There are men in fine linen and men in rough wool. There are enslaved people running errands for their owners, visible in their status by a combination of clothing and behavior, and the absence of the easy authority that free Athenians carry in their posture. There are women, not many in the public center, more at the edges, at the water fountain that is itself a social gathering point, but present, not entirely invisible.
There are foreigners, the medics, the resident aliens who made up perhaps a third of Athens's free population, and who contributed enormously to its economic and intellectual life, while being permanently excluded from its political life. Aristotle himself, born in Macedonia and resident in Athens for decades, was a medic. He could not vote. He could not own land. He paid a special tax that citizens did not pay. He also produced the most comprehensive philosophical system of the ancient world.
You eat at a stall near the Agora. Bread and olives and a hard salty cheese and a small cup of wine diluted heavily with water, because drinking undiluted wine is considered barbaric in Athens, a sign of the self-destructive excess that Greeks associate with non-Greek peoples. The water dilution is not primarily about alcohol content. It is about civic virtue. The man who controls his appetites, who takes his wine measured and moderate, is the man capable of governing himself, and therefore of participating in the government of the city.
Athens connects food to politics in ways that are specific and deliberate.
The meal costs almost nothing. The copper obol that a day laborer earns in an hour, you pay with nothing, and the stall keeper accepts this with the philosophical resignation of someone who has seen stranger things in a city that is, after all, full of philosophers.
Above you, visible from almost everywhere in the city, the Acropolis.
The rock itself is the original Athens, the defensible hilltop where the first settlements were built, where the earliest Athenians retreated when danger threatened. Over centuries it accumulated temples, the physical expression of the city's relationship with its gods, until Pericles' building program, funded by the tribute paid by Athens' allies in the Delian League, which Athens has by this point converted from a defensive alliance into something closer to an empire, produced the ensemble of buildings that stands there now. The Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike, each related to the others in proportion and material, and the particular quality of Athenian certainty that beauty and power and divine favor are the same thing expressed in different forms.
The Parthenon contains a statue of Athena, 40 feet tall, made of ivory and gold. Chryselephantine, the technique of attaching thin plates of ivory and gold to a wooden core. The gold alone weighs over a ton. It is technically state treasure as much as religious object, the gold removable in times of financial crisis. Pericles was accused by his enemies of embezzling some of it. He denied it.
The statue no longer exists. The Parthenon no longer has its roof, or its gold, or its paint. What survives is the stone structure, stripped by centuries of war and conversion and the extraction of materials for other purposes. The building you see on the Acropolis today is what remains after all of that.
The building the Athenians see right now in 430 BC is something else entirely.
Let's talk about the Peloponnesian War because it is happening right now. And you cannot understand Athens in 430 BC without understanding that the city is at war.
The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BC. Last year, from your perspective in 430, it is Athens and its empire against Sparta and its allies, and it will last 27 years. The causes are multiple and debated. Spartan fear of Athenian power, Athenian commercial expansion into areas where Spartan allies had interests, the accumulated tensions of two fundamentally different civilizations that had been allies against Persia and had since grown into rivals for dominance of the Greek world.
Athens' strategy, designed by Pericles, is to avoid land battle, Sparta's strength, and to use Athenian naval superiority and the wealth of the Athenian Empire to outlast Sparta economically. The strategy requires the population of Attica to abandon the countryside when Sparta invades and retreat inside Athens' walls, letting the Spartans burn the farms and gardens and olive groves that represent generations of accumulated agricultural investment, trusting that the empire's tribute will compensate.
The strategy is rational. It is also the condition that created the plague. The countryside population crowding inside the walls, the density, the disruption of normal sanitation. These are the conditions that let the disease spread.
Pericles' strategy for winning the war accidentally created the conditions for the worst public health catastrophe Athens had ever experienced. He died of the plague the following year, in 429 BC. The war he designed and could not outlive went on without him for 26 more years, ending in Athenian defeat.
History does not always reward good strategy.
Let's go up.
The Acropolis is accessible to most visitors. You climb the processional way that leads to the Propylaea, the great gateway, and pass through it into the sacred precinct where the temples stand. Non-Athenians can enter. Enslaved people in certain roles might enter. Women enter for religious purposes. The Acropolis is not a closed government district. It is a religious site, and religious sites in the Greek world have their own rules of access that are not primarily about political status.
Standing before the Parthenon for the first time, you experience something that images of it do not prepare you for: scale. The building is larger than it looks in photographs. The columns are taller. The frieze that runs around the top of the exterior wall, carved with the Panathenaic procession, the annual religious parade that brought a new robe to the goddess Athena, is so high that even in this period, at its original height, it was barely visible from below. Art historians have argued for centuries about whether the frieze was meant to be seen or meant to exist, the offering of a level of craftsmanship that the human eye could not fully appreciate, but the goddess could.
The sculptor Phidias designed it, or supervised it. The scale of the project required many hands. He also made the great cult statue inside, the 40-foot chryselephantine Athena. He was later prosecuted in the political climate that developed after Pericles' enemies went after Pericles' associates for embezzlement of the gold for the statue. He fled Athens or died in prison. The accounts differ.
The man who made the Parthenon's greatest work did not end well. This is more common in the history of art than the celebratory version of art history suggests.
Good night. For now.
Second day.
You have found the ecclesia, the assembly, the political institution that Athenians called democracy, the gathering of the citizens of Athens who met roughly 40 times a year on the Pnyx Hill, the semicircular slope facing the Acropolis, to debate and vote on the questions of the city. Declarations of war, treaties with other states, the appointment of generals, the allocation of public funds, the punishment of officials who had exceeded their authority.
Anyone can attend. Anyone who is a citizen.
Let's talk about who is a citizen, because this is where the celebrated democracy of Athens requires the most careful attention.
A citizen of Athens in 430 BC is a man who is the legitimate son of an Athenian father and, since the citizenship law passed by Pericles himself in 451 BC, an Athenian mother as well. He must have completed his military training. He must be free, not enslaved.
That is the complete list.
Women are not citizens. Women in Athens have no legal personhood as such. They are represented in legal matters by a male guardian called a kyrios, first their father, then their husband, then their son. They cannot appear in court on their own behalf. They cannot own property independently. They cannot vote. They cannot speak in the assembly.
Enslaved people are not citizens. Athens in 430 BC may have had as many enslaved people as it had free people. The estimates range, but a ratio of roughly 1 enslaved person to every free person is plausible, and some historians put the enslaved population higher. These were not primarily people born into slavery in Athens, though some were. Many were prisoners of war, or people purchased through the slave markets of the Aegean, or the children of enslaved parents. They worked in the silver mines of Larion, a work so brutal and so dangerous that the life expectancy underground was measured in years. They worked in households, in workshops, in the fields of Attica. Some enslaved people in Athens had considerable practical autonomy. Enslaved craftsmen who ran workshops, enslaved bankers who managed significant financial operations. None of them had political existence.
Metics, resident foreigners, are not citizens. They may have been born in Athens. They may have lived there their entire lives. They may be wealthy, educated, essential to the city's economic functioning. They are not citizens.
So, a city of perhaps 300,000 people in Attica, of whom perhaps 30 to 40,000 are adult male citizens, the people who can participate in the democracy. The rest are present, essential, and politically invisible.
The men on the Pnyx are debating something. The speaker is visible from where you are standing, elevated slightly, projecting his voice across the assembled crowd with the practiced skill of an Athenian orator, which is its own art form with its own training and its own literature. The crowd responds, shouts of approval or disapproval, the particular sound of 5,000 men expressing collective opinion without formal procedure.
Athenian democracy was direct democracy, not representative. The citizens themselves voted in person on the questions before them. This required a commitment of time that was made possible by two things: the relative wealth of Athens, which meant that the basic needs of citizens were met with less grinding daily labor than was required in poorer societies, and the labor of the enslaved people whose work freed citizen men for political participation.
The democracy ran on slavery. This is not a rhetorical point. It is a structural observation. The time that Athenian men spent in the assembly and the courts and the philosophical conversations of the Agora was time that was not spent growing food or making pottery or building things, and the gap was filled by enslaved labor. The democracy and the slavery were not incidentally related. They were structurally connected.
Pericles' funeral oration, delivered in the winter of 431 BC, the year before your visit, at the public funeral for the first Athenian soldiers to die in the Peloponnesian War, is one of the most celebrated speeches in Western history. Thucydides recorded it or reconstructed it in his History of the War. In it, Pericles describes Athenian democracy as the model for civilization, the city where law treats all men equally, where birth does not determine advancement, where the capable rise regardless of their origin, where the citizen who does not participate in public life is not considered quiet but useless.
He was talking about 40,000 men.
The 300,000 other people in Attica, the enslaved, the women, the foreigners, were not part of this.
They were the ground on which the celebrated 40,000 stood. They were the conditions that made the celebrated 40,000 possible.
This does not make the Athenian democratic experiment trivial. It made something real, something that had not existed before in the same form, something that the Western political tradition has been arguing about and extending. Slowly, incompletely, never quite finishing, for 2,500 years. The argument about who the democracy includes is itself one of Athenian democracy's most consequential gifts to the future. It raised the question in a form that could not be permanently answered by excluding any particular group, and every subsequent democracy has had to engage with it.
But, sitting here on the Phoenix in 430 BC, watching the assembly that will be celebrated for millennia, it is worth knowing what you are watching. You are watching a fraction of a city make decisions for all of it.
After the assembly, you walk to the Stoa of Zeus, one of the colonnaded walkways at the edge of the Agora, and you find a conversation in progress.
A man of perhaps 60, wearing a simple himation, barefoot despite the heat of the stones, is talking with a group of younger men. He is not teaching exactly. He is asking questions that the young men answer with what they think they know. And then he asks another question that shows that what they knew was incomplete or inconsistent. And they try again, and he asks another question.
This is Socrates.
You cannot know this for certain. He looks like what the later portraits suggest. Heavyset, flat-nosed, physically undistinguished. The description is consistent. The method, the electic questioning, the dismantling of assumed knowledge, the relentless pursuit of definition is consistent.
He has not yet been tried. That will happen in 399 BC, 30 years from now. He has not yet been condemned to drink the hemlock. He is simply here in the Agora, doing the only thing he ever did, asking questions.
Let's talk about the law courts, because Athenian law is one of the most distinctive features of the democracy, and because it will matter enormously in 30 years when Socrates stands trial in one of them.
The Athenian court system used large juries, not 12 men, but hundreds of citizens, sometimes over 1,000, chosen by lot. The use of the lot was itself ideological. Random selection meant that any citizen was as likely as any other to serve, that the courts belonged to the demos rather than to any elite that might gain permanent control of them. The juries were paid a small fee for their service, which made jury duty accessible to citizens who needed to work, rather than just to the wealthy.
Cases were argued by the parties themselves. There were no professional lawyers, though there were professional speechwriters, called logographers, who wrote speeches for clients who would then deliver them in court as if the words were their own. Lysias, Demosthenes, Socrates, the great Athenian orators were often logographers, and their speeches survive, our most direct window into Athenian legal argumentation and Athenian attitudes toward justice and civic life.
The juries voted by secret ballot. Each juror received 2 discs, one solid and one hollow, and deposited one in an urn while discarding the other, the secrecy of the process protecting jurors from social pressure. The verdict was determined by majority vote. The penalty, if the defendant was found guilty, was sometimes proposed by the defendant themselves. In Socrates' trial, he would infamously propose free meals at public expense as his punishment, which the jury took as an insult and responded to with a death sentence.
The jurors who condemned Socrates were not monsters. They were ordinary Athenian men, frightened by a destabilizing philosopher in a city that had recently survived plague and defeat and oligarchy. The democracy killed Socrates. That is the part of the story that is hardest to hold on to. It was the democratic institution, the large popular jury, the mechanism of the people's justice, that voted to execute the man who had spent his life serving the city's intellectual life.
Democracy can do terrible things. The Athenians knew this. They had written it into their own history.
Good night.
Third morning.
Let's stay with Socrates for a moment, because he is the most consequential person in this city in 430 BC. And because his presence here, on this corner, in this conversation, barefoot in this heat, is the beginning of something that has not yet ended.
Socrates wrote nothing. Everything we know about him comes from other people's accounts, primarily the dialogues of Plato, which are themselves literary works written decades after Socrates' death, and which may or may not accurately represent what Socrates actually said. The historical Socrates is embedded inside the literary Socrates and cannot be cleanly extracted.
What we know, he was born in Athens around 470 BC, the son of a sculptor and a midwife. He served as a soldier in the Peloponnesian War and distinguished himself. The accounts of his physical endurance and his courage in battle are consistent across sources. He spent most of his adult life in philosophical conversation in the Agora, engaging anyone who would talk with him about the nature of virtue, of justice, of piety, of knowledge, of the good life.
He claimed to know nothing. This was not false modesty. He meant something specific, that the unexamined certainties people carry through their lives are not knowledge, that what passes for wisdom is usually comfortable habit, and that real knowledge requires the kind of rigorous examination that most people find uncomfortable and therefore avoid.
The questions Socrates asked are still open.
What is justice? The question sounds simple. Every political argument in every democracy is an argument about justice, about what people are owed by their society and by each other. Socrates asked it in the Agora in Athens, and it echoes in every court case and every legislative debate, and every argument about economic inequality and criminal punishment that happens today.
What is virtue? Can it be taught? Socrates' investigation of this question, pursued across multiple Platonic dialogues, produced the conclusion that virtue might be a form of knowledge, that the person who truly understands what is good will necessarily do what is good, that wrongdoing is always a form of ignorance. This is a strange conclusion to modern ears, but the argument behind it is rigorous, and the questions it raises about the relationship between knowing and doing, about why people act against their own stated values, remain unresolved.
What is the good life? Not the comfortable life, or the successful life, or the pleasurable life, but the good one, the life worth living, the life that is best for the person living it. Socrates argued that the examined life, the life in which these questions are actively engaged rather than avoided, is the only life worth calling good. He argued this at his trial, when he was given the option of exile rather than death. He refused to accept exile precisely because exile would require him to stop doing philosophy. A life without philosophy was not worth living.
He chose death over a life without questions.
The theater.
In 430 BC, the theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Acropolis is the site of the city Dionysia, the annual festival at which tragedies and comedies are performed before the entire city. Not a private entertainment, but a civic event. Thousands of Athenians and visitors attending together. The performances funded by wealthy citizens as a public obligation. The audience including slaves, who attended some performances, and visitors from other cities, and in some periods, women.
Sophocles is active right now. The Oedipus plays Oedipus Rex, Antigone, Oedipus at Colonus are being written in these years. You may be in Athens in the year that Oedipus Rex is first performed.
Oedipus Rex is a play about the limits of human knowledge,
about the gap between what we think we know and what is actually true, about the horror that can live inside what we call good news. The oracle says Oedipus will kill his father and marry his mother. He flees to escape the prophecy. His flight is the mechanism by which the prophecy is fulfilled.
There is a reading of this play, not the only reading, not the definitive one, that places it in the same intellectual space as Socrates' questions. Both are concerned with what we think we know. Both suggest that the confidence of the ignorant is more dangerous than the uncertainty of the wise. Oedipus is certain. His certainty is his destruction.
Sophocles wrote this in the city where Socrates was asking his questions. The tragedies and the philosophy are not separate things. They are the same investigation conducted in different forms.
Let's talk about women, because we should not leave Athens without looking more carefully at the life that made up half the city.
The women of classical Athens lived in the accounts of ancient writers, primarily inside their homes. The oikos, the household, which was the domain assigned to women as the public space of the city, was assigned to men. The household was not trivial. The household economy managed the family's resources, organized the labor of any enslaved people the family owned, produced and preserved food, made clothing, raised children, maintained the religious practices of the family hearth. The household was the foundation on which everything else stood.
But the idealizing picture of the secluded Athenian wife, never leaving the house, never speaking to a man who was not her husband or a close relative, is probably too extreme. Women attended religious festivals, and Athens had many, some of them women, only some mixed. Women attended funerals, which were major public events. Women who needed to earn money, and many did, because not every Athenian household was wealthy, worked in markets and in workshops. Enslaved women moved through the city, performing the tasks their owners required.
The most educated and publicly present women in Athens were the heterae, educated companions, women who occupied a social position between prostitution and what another culture might call concubinage, but who were often women of genuine learning and conversational ability who participated in the intellectual life of the city in ways that citizen wives did not. Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, was reportedly one of the most intellectually formidable people in Athens. Socrates himself is said to have attended her conversations. She influenced the funeral oration. She was Milesian, not Athenian. She could not vote. She had no formal standing. She may have shaped the most famous speech in Athenian democratic history.
The evening brings cooler air off the sea. You are sitting at the edge of the Agora as it empties, the merchants packing their stalls, the lawyers and their clients dispersing from the law courts, the philosophical conversations breaking up as hunger and tiredness assert themselves over the desire for knowledge.
Somewhere in the city, Thucydides is writing. He is taking notes on the war that has just begun. The Peloponnesian War, Sparta against Athens, the conflict that will last 27 years and end in Athenian defeat and the permanent ending of the Golden Age. He is writing consciously for posterity, for the people who will need to understand wars that are in their essential nature, like this war, the wars that every civilization will fight in every century. He writes that he is producing a possession for all time.
He is right. Let's talk about slavery, because we are in the Agora in Core 3 BC, and enslaved people are visible in every direction, and we should look at them directly.
The enslaved population of Attica was probably between 80,000 and 100,000 people. Some were domestic workers in Athenian households, cooking, cleaning, raising children,
managing the household economy under the direction of the wife or the husband. Some were skilled craftspeople, potters, metalworkers, builders, working in workshops, sometimes earning wages that their owners collected, sometimes allowed to keep a portion. Some managed shops and banks with considerable practical autonomy.
And some worked in the silver mines of Laurion in the southern part of Attica. Laurion was the source of the silver that funded the Athenian fleet, that paid for the temples on the Acropolis, that made Athens rich enough to do everything Athens did. The work in the mines was performed by enslaved people, in shafts sometimes less than a meter high, with no ventilation, with primitive lamps burning olive oil that consumed the available oxygen, with no protection against cave-ins, with toxic lead and silver dust accumulating in their lungs.
Estimates of life expectancy for enslaved mine workers at Laurion suggest years, not decades. People were worked to death in the mines that funded the Parthenon.
Athens had roughly 20,000 registered citizens in the mid-5th century BC. There were, at various times, as many as 20,000 enslaved people working in the Laurion mines simultaneously. The numbers are almost perfectly parallel, the democracy and its mirror image maintained at the same scale, side by side.
This is not an argument that Athens was nothing. Athens was something extraordinary. But extraordinary things can contain terrible things simultaneously. The examination of history requires holding both.
Good night.
This is the last night.
You have been in Athens in the summer of 430 BC, and you have been, without fully realizing it, in a city that is already frightened. The Peloponnesian War began last year. Sparta and its allies have invaded Attica, burning the farms and the villages of the countryside, and the population of Attica has crowded inside Athens's walls. Tens of thousands of refugees from the countryside, adding to the city's already dense population, camping in the spaces between buildings, in the temples, on the streets.
And then this summer, a disease arrived.
The plague of Athens.
Thucydides describes it in detail, the most detailed clinical description of any epidemic in the ancient world, written by a man who contracted the disease himself and survived. It came by ship from somewhere to the south, possibly Africa or the Levant. It spread through the crowded city with terrifying speed. Thucydides' description of the symptoms: intense fever, inflammation of the eyes, throat and tongue inflamed and bleeding, violent sneezing and coughing, painful retching, skin covered in small blisters and ulcers, extreme restlessness, inability to sleep, unquenchable thirst. Those who survived sometimes lost their fingers, their toes, their eyes. The disease attacked the extremities, suggesting the body was fighting to preserve its core.
The disease killed roughly a third of Athens' population. Perhaps 100,000 people. Over the course of several years, beginning with this summer, it killed Pericles in 429 BC. It killed men in their prime. It killed the enslaved people who had no choice but to remain in the city. It killed without discrimination the democratic citizen and the person excluded from the democracy equally.
What the plague revealed, Thucydides says, was the city's character under pressure.
When people believed they were going to die regardless of how they behaved, many of them stopped behaving according to social norms. The plague created a crisis of civic order. Why honor the gods if the gods were killing their own priests? Why obey the laws if the laws couldn't protect you? Why defer gratification if there was no future to defer to? Thucydides describes the collapse of religious observance, the abandonment of traditional burial practices. There were too many dead to bury properly, so bodies were placed on other people's funeral pyres, and a general license that the certainty of death temporarily granted.
He also describes the opposite: people caring for the sick at great personal risk, dying in the attempt.
but unwilling to leave others to die alone. The plague did not produce only selfishness. It produced the full range of human response, from the most self-interested to the most self-sacrificing.
This is what epidemics always reveal, in every century. Not a simple answer about human nature, but the range of it. The spectrum from fear-driven selfishness to extraordinary courage, often in the same city, sometimes in the same person at different moments.
No one knows what the plague of Athens actually was. Modern scholars have proposed typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, viral hemorrhagic fevers similar to Ebola, or a combination of multiple diseases. DNA analysis of teeth from a mass grave in Athens, published in 2006, suggested typhoid fever, but the evidence is not conclusive, and the debate continues.
The uncertainty itself is significant. Thucydides' description is extraordinarily detailed by ancient standards. And yet, 2,500 years of medical science has not been able to definitively identify the disease. Either it was a disease that no longer exists in its 430 BC form, or the description doesn't match any single modern disease exactly, or the DNA evidence from the burial site is incomplete.
The plague that killed a third of Athens and helped end its golden age remains, in the most literal sense, unidentified.
Let's talk about what Athens left behind, because the city we have been walking through this week did not simply end.
The Peloponnesian War ended in 404 BC with Athenian defeat. Sparta dismantled the long walls that connected Athens to its port. The democracy was briefly replaced by an oligarchy called the 30 Tyrants. Democracy was restored. And then, in 399 BC, Socrates was tried and convicted and executed, charged with impiety and corrupting the youth.
The trial of Socrates is one of the most discussed events in the history of philosophy. The charges were real. He had questioned the gods. He had attracted young men who then, in some cases, acted badly, but the execution seems to most observers across the centuries wildly disproportionate. A city that had survived the plague and the war, and the oligarchy was frightened and diminished, and Socrates was an easy target for that fear. He did not flee. He did not stop arguing. He drank the hemlock.
Plato, who witnessed the death of Socrates at 28 years old, spent the rest of his long life writing philosophy. The academy he founded in Athens educated, among others, Aristotle. Aristotle educated Alexander the Great. Through these chains of transmission, teacher to student, text to reader, thought to thought, Athenian philosophy shaped the entire intellectual tradition of the Western world.
The Parthenon became a Christian church, then a mosque, then an ammunition dump that the Venetians blew up in 1687. The fragments were scattered across museums. Casts of the sculptures exist in London and Copenhagen and other places that were fortunate enough to make them before the originals deteriorated further.
The democracy became a model. Imperfect, incomplete, built on exclusions that later democracies would have to painfully extend or abandon, for every subsequent attempt to govern by the consent of the governed. Every democracy that exists today is in conversation with Athens, arguing about what Athens got right and what it got wrong, and what it means to extend the promise of democratic participation to everyone, rather than to 40,000 men.
You have been here 1 week. You have seen the Parthenon in its paint. You have watched the assembly on the Pings. You have almost certainly seen Socrates, barefoot in the Agora, dismantling someone's confident assumptions. You have walked the streets of the most celebrated city in Western history and found them narrow, smelly, complicated, full of people who were more various and more contradictory than the simplified version suggests.
Athens was not a marble abstraction. It was a city of real people, most of whom had no vote, living in close quarters with each other, trying to manage their daily lives while the plague moved through the streets and the war moved through the countryside,
and the great men of the age argued about justice in the spaces between.
The plague is here now. You can feel it in the quiet of the streets, the slightly reduced traffic in the Agora, the cough you heard this morning that you couldn't locate.
You leave tomorrow.
Tonight, from the edge of the Acropolis, you have found a place where a low wall offers a view over the city toward the sea. The harbor of Piraeus is visible in the last light, the triremes at anchor, the lights of the city spreading below you.
Somewhere down there, Thucydides is writing. He is writing about a city that is greater than any single crisis, and also about a city that is already in the beginning of its end. And he knows both things simultaneously, and he is trying to hold them together on the page without resolving the tension. Because the tension is the truth.
He is writing about this city, about this week, about the gap between what Athens claimed to be and what it actually was, and about the fact that the claim itself was extraordinary, and the gap was real, and both things matter.
One more thing before the city sleeps.
Athens produced in the span of roughly 100 years between 4090 and 390 BC an astonishing concentration of human achievement in drama, philosophy, history, architecture, and political thought. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the history of Herodotus and Thucydides, the buildings of the Acropolis, the democratic experiment that, however flawed and limited, asked the question of self-governance in a form that has never stopped being answered.
Why here? Why this city, in this century?
No one knows. The conditions are identifiable. The wealth from the silver mines, the naval empire, the particular competitive culture of a city of 10,000 adult male citizens, each of whom had to distinguish himself in a relatively small arena, the tradition of public disputation in the Agora and the assembly, the exposure to other cultures through the port of Piraeus. But these conditions existed in some form in other places and did not produce Athens.
The concentration of genius is one of history's most mysterious phenomena. Florence in the 15th century, Vienna in the late 19th, Athens in the 5th century BC. Something happens in certain places, at certain times, that has no fully satisfying explanation. The historian can identify the conditions. The historian cannot explain why the conditions produced what they produced here, and not somewhere else with similar conditions.
Maybe that's the right place to leave it. Some things resist complete explanation. Some things you have to stand in front of and experience directly, and accept that experience is larger than the analysis.
You have been standing in front of it all week.
Good night. Good night.